This video is an apology for the previous one. The Legend of Zelda franchise didn't start as a story franchise at all, even though it today is claimed to be Nintendo's storytelling franchise. But the thing about the Legend of Zelda series is that this franchise is much more complex than you would think. We've had multiple different races, facets, and these have been at times in conflict with each other. That is one of the biggest strengths of the entire franchise, the diversity, the variety, which led to a number of conflicts all the way to a common enemy was found in Ganondorf, but which also at the same time enriches the lore that we see outside of the games. And Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity offers a great opportunity to the Zelda franchise, as it finally takes on the biggest untold chapter of the Zelda series, namely the conflicts, which we have heard about in retrospect, being told by either a character or simply in the introduction of the game. It all started with A Link to the Past, which talked about the imprisoning war and how it sealed Ganon in the Dark World. And then this thread was also continued in Ocarina of Time with the bigger Hyrulean Civil War, where all kinds of races were against each other. But all of these stories that have many different layers are not very good material for adventure games, because during conflicts you usually are not able to go and explore shrines, temples, and the likes. You're on the battlefield. And that is what makes these chapters of the Zelda franchise so fitting for the Warriors formula. And my hope for Age of Calamity is that one of the biggest conflicts that has been in the entire Zelda franchise is successful, because that will create room for filling out these missing gaps in the Zelda franchise, and there's far more than you would think. Conflicts in Zelda have occurred ever since the very beginning. The ancient battle, then you have the Interloper War, you have the War of the Bound Chest, we have the Civil War, and many others throughout the entire series. And this is the dilemma that brings up many of the questions of how Zelda should approach story. One of the ways that they could do it is by giving us a game that is less story-filled and then followed by a game that is story-filled. And that is something that the Warriors franchise has the freedom of. If the Zelda series want to continue going to a more non-linear approach, then Hyrule Warriors games or other side games within the same Hyrule and the same time period could add very much needed story and exposition of characters. Something we didn't get in Breath of the Wild. And that is the big question, if that is the way the Zelda franchise should be going forward. One of the most interesting aspects about the entire franchise is time travel. The Zelda franchise has been playing around with this idea since pretty much Ocarina of Time, where time travel was literally made a part of the gameplay and continued so in Majora's Mask. Both Ocarina of Time, in fact, and Majora's Mask and Skyward Sword would have been impossible without time travel. And you could say as such that time travel is the overarching theme of the entire franchise, since it is a crucial part of mending or fixing a terrible, and I mean absolutely terrible, future in both Hyrule and outside Hyrule. And that is also what makes Age of Calamity so interesting, because could stories in Zelda be retold thanks to this simple but at the same time oh so efficient mechanic? That is a question that creates a foundation for a much more deeper and richer Zelda franchise, which doesn't only provide the best gameplay in the gaming industry, but possibly also the best story. The conflict of story and gameplay in Zelda is something that will continue. It will be there forever. And compromising the two is something that the Zelda team has been trying to do ever since Ocarina of Time in 1998. Excellent gameplay, and then I mean Breath of the Wild tier level gameplay, wouldn't have come without cutting out the linear story. While a good story cannot be a good story without a certain structure, a red thread, in Breath of the Wild they found a solution through the memories and telling the story whenever you approach the divine beasts, and then of course Hyrule Castle to the very end of the game and through DLC. But what I would like to see in the future of the Zelda series, and story specifically, is a combination. I think Nintendo is doing a very good move with Age of Calamity and the Hyrule Warriors franchise, which was completely wasted in the first Hyrule Warriors if you ask me. The story was just a mishmash. You need to focus on one time period at a time, because that creates development, that creates a much more focus on one specific set of characters, one specific goal, one specific location. And that is something I think is very crucial in the Zelda series forward. We need to be exploring these worlds that we establish through the next mainline entry in the series. And that is what makes the Breath of the Wild saga Zelda so special. It actually dares to explore Hyrule, not Hyrule and then other locations, through multiple games. First Breath of the Wild, then DLC, then Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, and finally The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild 2. So using pretty much a whole console generation just to provide the best possible gameplay in the industry, but at the same time also through it provide a story that makes the world that we are exploring the most interesting in the entire series. The Zelda franchise is far more complex than some like to point out. If you start reading into the lore and books like Creating a Champion, Hyrule Historia, Hyrule Encyclopedia, you will realize how deep and fragmented this world really is, and that without an absolute ruler in the form of the King of Hyrule, this land would have fragmented long ago, because the differences are just so vast, and the only thing keeping them together is this threat, everlasting curse. The Zelda franchise is probably the most interesting point because of this in the entire franchise. We don't know what will happen after Breath of the Wild 2, officially the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. We see a conflict now that revolves about trying to contain the darkness, but also go behind the source of it, to get rid of it once and for all. So what I would like to see in the future of the Zelda franchise, especially after Breath of the Wild 2, is that we continue the formula of the Breath of the Wild era on the Nintendo Switch. You create a beloved gameplay masterpiece of a game in the first entry, in the first mainline entry. Then you follow up with a Warriors title that covers that specific time period, and all of this is planned from the get-go. You have the main game, DLC, then the Warriors installment that explains the story or a certain conflict that was tied to the main game, and then finally a resolution, the big confrontation at the end of it. And this way, Zelda could develop into, instead of just being a long timeline of games, into a more contained trilogy of games, where we tell a different story for every generation of consoles, beginning with a mainline game, then a DLC, side game, and then a conclusion, and then starting all over again in the next generation. This way, the Zelda franchise will be able to have many different realities, but at the same time also have some threads that connect them together. And best of all, turning the Zelda franchise into an eternal franchise. A franchise that can constantly change, evolve, and adapt to the current trends in the industry, but also when it comes to storytelling, which I think is beneficial for the franchise and for all of us who love and treasure this franchise that is about to turn 35 years old. So what do you think in the comment section down below? This was more of a monologue about story, the potential, and also a little bit of a conflict that gameplay and story has had in the Zelda franchise, and I'm probably going to make a much more deeper and researched video when it comes to this topic, specifically after Age of Calamity, maybe even Breath of the Wild 2, depending on how things go in Age of Calamity. But at the end of the day, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, subscribe if you haven't already, and of course, if you want to be notified about our upcoming Zelda videos, and then specifically Age of Calamity and Breath of the Wild 2, then be sure to press that notification bell, and again for all notifications. A big thanks goes as always to all our gracious patrons on patreon.com/commonrealm, and then in particular our royal producer Charles Shash. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and please enjoy one or both of these two awesome videos.